Hello there everyone. So as you noticed in the previous video, I, Vatsanu Jayatilaka, a tutor from the Department of Social Sciences, General Sir John Kuthalala Defence University, gave you a versatile explanation about how the heartland theory and the rimland theory, which are the two main geopolitical theories in the current academia and the current scope of geopolitics in the world, were used to explain on how the Russian-Ukrainian conflict occurred. So in the previous video, I gave a brief explanation about the understanding of the conflict based on those two geopolitical theories. Now I will be giving you a brief overview of how the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has evolved further international relations theories, especially geopolitical theories, into bringing this conflict into the scope of understanding how this conflict shaped and how does this conflict affects the academics of the international relations field. One of the two most main theories that can be taken into this conflict in play is the collective security aspect of international relations and the alliance perspective of international relations. Now, the words might seem so heavy on you, so rest assured I'll try to make it simple as possible to make sure to understand how does this conflict take place in terms of understanding the collective security element of international relations and alliance perspective of international relations and global politics. Okay, so moving on to the current perspective of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. As you so far know that President Donald Trump has been elected at the United States of America, where he has a completely different view of the previous President Joe Biden's administration's view on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There were particular differences and different stances on both of the administration's views and perspectives towards the conflict. Nevertheless, let us understand how does this conflict has shaped the role between understanding the two theories. So, as I said you about collective security and alliance. So, let me just dive into the collective security part. So, simply collective security is known as an agreement by multiple states or number of states on agreeing to not have any hostile or any military actions towards each other respecting their sovereignties, and if one of the members decides to disagree and launch military action or a full-scale war with the partnered or agreed member state, the entire members in that particular agreement has to take military action towards against the aggressor. So that is the remnant of understanding collective security treaty. So for example, we have two main instances where the collective security aspect has been taken place. One is the United Nations Security Council, where any particular member state, if they do attack against another member state, the entire member state has the right to attack that particular aggressor based on a mutual vote on whether to decide whether this action is justifiable or not, but that's a separate subject related to the United Nations Security Council. The second most example that we can take to the collective security framework is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. So CSTO was actually founded after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The CSTO consists of former Soviet member states, where they have agreed each other that if any of the member states attack to another member state within their particular framework, all the other member states have the right to likewise take action against the aggressor. So that's the collective security framework of understanding the geopolitical theories in terms of how the conflicts foreplays between member states and all. So the second element that we can take is alliances. Now, understanding alliances seems to be far more bit complicated. Now, when it comes to alliances, it might seem more complex when it comes to differentiating between collective security and alliances. Therefore, what is the definition of alliance? So, alliance is simply a group of member states joining together in arms in order to defend their sovereignty or maybe particular towards the interest based on the similar national interest between those member states. They form an alliance in order to share their ambitions or share their goals in terms of. Okay, as we've spoken about collective security, let us focus on to now the alliance of geopolitics. So an alliance is obviously an agreement between member states where the member states agreed upon sharing similar interests according to their state respective national interests towards working together in terms of military or economy. So If we talk about alliance in military wise, there are number of examples between throughout our history where countries have formed alliances to take particular actions as a group or as a joint declaration or statement. Speaking from World War II, we had the Axis Alliance, the Allied Alliance, and then during the Cold War we have the NATO alliances, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then the Soviet Alliance, Warsaw Treaty Organization. So currently we, under this framework, we can take particularly NATO as an alliance, which is a dominative alliance, and thus we will be focusing on how collective security and alliance have affected the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Particularly, we will be talking about how NATO's role has played a pivotal role in this conflict. Alright, I explained you a similar description about alliances and collective security in terms of theories in international relations or geopolitical theories. So we'll be resuming about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and how collective security and alliance has shaped this conflict. So as you know, in the last video I just gave you a brief introduction on how the conflict has taken place, particularly focusing on the Rimland theory and the Heartland theory. Now focusing on the today's theories that I explained, the collective security and the alliance theory. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is a significant instance where this conflict has shaped the dynamics of alliances and collective security. So talking about the concepts of alliances and collective security, we'll be diving into the historical element of this conflict, where these two theories, the collective security and alliances, has pivotal role. So as we know, Ukraine and Russia were once the great or a powerful Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was in a union with the Soviet Socialist Federative Republic. Both together they formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. Not just Ukraine, there were plenty of states like Belarus, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. They were all part of the Soviet Union. The mighty Soviet Union, which was a bastion of communism, which had a pivotal role in the Cold War and its historical role in World War II. The Soviet Union was about to be in the brink of collapse in 1991. As per the collapse was nearby, many Soviet leaders had an agreement with the Western leaders to continue Western negotiations and Western cooperation by agreeing to the mutual understanding of no aggression towards each other despite the loss of balance of power in the region. So in matter of the context that I said, basically what happened was Western nations and states agreed with the Soviet Union that there will be no any military or hostile actions towards, even if the Soviet Union collapses, even if the Soviet Union is dissolved. In this case, particularly in the late 90s, former Soviet President Mikhail agreed with Ronald Reagan that the NATO expansion towards the east would not happen, which gave the Soviets a guarantee that there won't be any Western expansion towards the Soviet Union. However, we know that the Soviet Union collapsed, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian President Boris Yeltsin and Western leaders made agreement that there won't be any NATO expansion towards the east, which the Russians were very comfortable in this. And as part of the agreement, Russia also agreed that they would not use any military actions or military force towards any post-Soviet state nations after the post-Soviet nations gained independence. And in light of that, it went to far such instances where even the Ukrainian nation gave up their nuclear missiles to the Russian Federation in the opportunity of seeking a security guarantee from Russia. So this is how the historical element played between the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But as we know, in 1997, there was a series of NATO expansion towards the east, particularly Hungary, Poland joined the NATO bloc. Along with this, the Russian Federation seems that the agreements that they made with the Western nations seems to be breached or violated. Nevertheless, the Russian Federation was a bit flexible towards it because they understood that these nations had long decided to be connected with Europe. However, in 2008, since Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria were actually not part of the Soviet Union, they were part of rather the Soviet military alliance between the Eastern European nations and the Soviet Union. For example, Warsaw Treaty Organizations. NATO started expanding towards its former Soviet states such as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia joining the NATO bloc. This kind of breached an alarm towards the Russian Federation, where they seem that the extent to their agreement has violated that there are post-Soviet nations that were within the Soviet Union Federation. It went to such alarming that the Russians believed that their agreement has been violated in a very hazardous way, that they believe the post-Soviet states that were part of the Soviet Union even started joining NATO. For example, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia joined NATO. This kind of made the Russian leadership a bit alarming, that they knew that the Western nations are not upholding to their agreement. And in this also particular moment, that the Russian Federation believed that they were seeking to join NATO as well. We can see in numerous interviews by Western journalists and through the mass media where there has been an interest by the Russian Federation to join NATO. However, the Western nation did not have a desire to make Russia a NATO member. So with these contrasting things, what happened was simply the Russian Federation knew that the Cold War mentality of aggression and expansion towards Russia is still exists Western foreign policy towards Russia. So this made the Russian Federation a bit more hostile towards the Western nations. We can see that in 2008, President Vladimir Putin openly in front of many Western leaders, in his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference 2008, raised the alarm that NATO should not expand towards the Russian borders. And of course, back in 1997, along with the War of Terror campaign launched by the US, Russia really wanted to join NATO. They expressed their interest to President Bill Clinton, President George Bush. So all these interests and these alarming messages actually had a very deep impact on the geopolitical conflict. What happened was, after Russia's change of posture towards the Western nation, which became from friendly to a bit more hostile, then President George Bush declared that Ukraine and Georgia, which were two particular main nations that were part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, wanted to join NATO. This made the Russians a bit more very hostile. As a matter of fact, before the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, there was a war between Russia and Georgia in 2008. Citing again minority and ethnic issues bit of the Russians in Georgia. So these kind of contrasts has happened, but then again that conflict was nullified big thanks to the leadership between the Russian Federation and Georgian leadership coming to an agreement that they would not breach their mutual understanding. As a matter of fact, this led to a prelude that Russia was kind of taken in a defensive position of safeguarding its border. Rather, it was valuing its security partnerships with surrounding post-Soviet states. In light of this, Western nations were also focused on developing NATO partnerships among many other countries. And particularly in 2012, the Ukrainian leadership, especially the people of Ukraine, had a desire to join European Union, when then it was nullified by the former president Viktor Yanukovych, who was also to believe a pro-Russian president. That the former president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, stated that Ukraine should not join European Union, rather it should develop its ties with Russia, which quite made the people of Ukraine mad, which led to a coup, the Ukraine Maidan, where half of the population were citing that Ukraine should be either join the European Union or be more pro-Western, while other half of the population, which majority of the ethnic Russians, believe that the country of Ukraine should remain with the Russian leadership. It should develop its ties with Russia. So along with that, a certain conflict brewed in Ukraine, and as a matter of fact that the Russian minorities in eastern Ukraine felt threatened as for the rise of Ukrainian nationalism, especially the rise of ultra-nationalism in Ukraine, which kind of increased the violence between Ukrainians and Russians in Ukrainian territory. This particularly made the Russian Federation to be more alarming, that the Russians, some of the ethnic minorities, Russians in Ukraine, requested help from Russia to join their federation, to be a part of it, due to the insecurity of being in Ukraine under a Ukrainian, ultra-nationalist Ukrainian leadership. As a matter of fact, in 2014, there was a referendum in Crimea, where Crimea voted 95% of joining the Russian Federation. So we see that there has been a brewing of conflict within there. Now, coming back to the conflict. So in 2020, what happened was, as we know that the Russians were completely against NATO expansion towards the east, and the Western Ukrainian state wants to increase cooperation with the West. In 2020, Vladimir Zelensky met with President Joe Biden, where President Joe Biden declared the interest that NATO would be interested in getting Ukraine into the NATO alliance. This gave a serious breach of violation, where the Russian President Vladimir Putin was completely against the maneuver, that he decided to rally the troops and conduct border exercise, stage the troops in the Ukrainian border along with the Russian border, which gave concerns that Russia is giving a strong message to the Western nations that Ukraine should not join NATO, or else there will be severe consequences. However, President Zelensky insisted that Ukraine will join NATO, and President Joe Biden, and then former President of the US, Joe Biden, the former President of Britain, Boris Johnson, they all said that Ukraine will be taken into NATO. As a matter of that concern, Russia decided to launch a special military operation. Okay, now, so what do we see from this? We see that there is a sense of Russia's defensive posture towards taking Ukraine, and we see that Ukrainians want to join NATO. So we need to take two things here. One crucial reason is that Ukraine was once a member of the CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, but however they were not, they left. And then we see Ukraine want to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an alliance. NATO was originally designed as an alliance against the Soviet Union, while CSTO was an alliance to keep Russian influence between the post-Soviet states. So these two theories have not clashed with each other. Hence, this conflict has also changed the dynamics of it. For example, Ukraine's shift from a collective security approach to an alliance approach has alarmed the Russian state, while Ukraine is also, the Western nations are considering of forming an alliance with Ukraine by absorbing them into NATO partnership, which will eventually lead to possible confrontation between NATO and Russia. We need to understand two things. The collective security approach and the alliance approaches are two crucial approaches in terms of war and conflict in the global political world. It decides the fate of a nation, and it designs the future of a nation's path in terms of designing the nation's fate in these modern contemporary challenges in a global political world. So these two concepts, alliances, collective security, plays a crucial role in the Ukrainian and Russian conflict. So that is it for today on winding up our discussion on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, particularly highlighting the collective security and alliances. Therefore, we believe that you might have got a sense of how this alliance and collective security has played a crucial role in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Please do subscribe to our channel and await for much more videos in the future. Thank you.